Well, welcome everybody to this policy exchange event on the future of the left. We have a very distinguished panel this evening, but I'm sorry to have to tell you that Richard Wilkinson, at the very last minute, has been unable to attend this evening and sends his huge apologies. But in his place, by happy coincidence, we do have Malcolm Clark, who is the campaign's director for One Society, who's working with Richard Wilkinson on his campaign. He's previously the director of Make Votes Count. Also on the panel we have Toynbee, who needs no introduction, as well as being one of the UK's most distinguished political commentators. She's also the author of several incredibly influential books, one on high pay, one on low pay, and another on whether Labour delivered. And lastly, but absolutely not leastly, we have Will Straw, previously a civil servant at the Treasury. Will is now the editor of probably the most influential left-wing blog out there at the moment, Left Foot Forward. All three have interesting things to say. I thought I'd start by saying that policy exchange is obviously interested in where the left is heading and where the arguments in politics are going. I do think that one of the most interesting new ideas to have entered political debate are some of the ideas around this rather well-selling book, The Spirit Level, which Richard and Kate Pickett wrote. The argument in it, which has certainly caused a lot of interest in conservative circles as well as being very influential on the left, it seems to me is an intriguing one, the argument that the problems associated with poverty are not simply due to a lack of money, but more fundamentally related to inequality and what a sense of inequality does to people's psychology is an intriguing one, and I think one which will increasingly be challenged and tested over the next couple of years, but certainly an important new contribution to the debate. So anyway, without any further commentary from me, I'm going to turn over first to Malcolm to say a few words about the ideas behind the campaign, and then we're going to hear some responses from Polly and from Will. And can I just start by saying, I think it's really quite good that someone can turn up to an event to sit there and listen, and then quickly be whisked onto the stage to speak. So thank you for stepping into the breach.
Yes, thank you. I don't think I've ever been in this position before, which is quite a fun, challenging one. I was just in the taxi a couple of minutes ago, jump in, get through the door, and it's up onto the platform. So, as I say, I'm not Richard, and I'm sorry myself I'm not Richard, because he is such a fantastic speaker, advocate, and I would say great mind on this issue. But what I can do is just quickly kind of run through a couple of the ideas that he's been working on, I say since well before I was born, and has published numbers of works on this in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, and then finally with The Spirit Level, which he co-wrote with Kate Pickett and was published last year. That's when these important issues and the research that he's done finally reached a kind of a wider audience and has started to be picked up. Now, what is it about The Spirit Level that has kind of got people's attention and made people, I would say, both in the social policy and welfare fields, but also, I would say, politicos and policymakers stand up and go, And it's, as one thing puts it, it's the theory of everything. That's a bit grand, but actually what the statistics, what I say Richard has done, looking at whole swathes of data on everything from life expectancy, teenage pregnancies, the rate of sort of violence and with children, imprisonment rates, and a whole series of these different supposedly unconnected things, was put them together and go, actually, there's a pattern here, and it's not a pattern that was expected, or not a pattern that was there, I would say, in the policy field widely thought of. We thought the expected thing was generally the wealthier a country gets, the better, the better the life expectancy, the better the quality of life for its citizens. And that's true. It's true as you move from being a low-income country to being more developed and you get a higher GDP, everyone benefits. But there becomes a point when that no longer happens, rises and then it tails off. And then no matter how much income GDP the country has, actually that doesn't make the difference. Citizens are not any healthier, happier, or I say the society is not a more cohesive one if the wealth increases. And that was the really interesting thing. You plot GDP against all these different factors, against life expectancy, imprisonment rates, teenage pregnancies, and amongst developed countries, there's no correlation. However, if you then put, instead of wealth, you put income inequality, the gap between kind of top and bottom incomes, and you put that as the kind of the factor, suddenly, instead of just being kind of random dots around, it's just like that. There is a very, very clear correlation. And this is not just for one factor, it's for almost every single sort of socioeconomic indicator there is. If you start plotting it, those that, I say, those countries that are more equal, their citizens are doing better. Those countries that have, I say, greater income inequality, and there's a wider gap between the rich and the poor, their citizens suffer. And it's not just internationally, so I mean, it's not just that those citizens in Japan, Sweden and Norway are doing better, and those people those of us in the UK and the USA, a couple of other countries are doing substantially worse. This pattern holds true in America too. If you take, so you'll quite like this one, you spent lots of time there, but if you take the 50 states of America and you plot them again in terms of kind of what their wealth is, what the wealth of their state is, there's no correlation between these different socioeconomic indicators. However, if you plot them according to what the income inequality, the income distribution is in those states, suddenly, again, from being random distribution, pretty straight. Those states that have more equal distribution of wealth, they're the states where their citizens live longer and are healthier. And that really is the key correlation in the spirit level, but it then gets taken one step further. And this is the bit that, I have to say, policymakers, the media, the Evening Standard, when it did its report, a very good report a couple of weeks ago on poverty, didn't get. And this point, actually, it's not just about the top and the bottom, it's about right the way through society, right the way through the income scale. If you live in a more unequal society, whether you're the bottom, the middle, or the top of that income scale, your life expectancy will be worse than your peers living in a more equal society. Say that again. Even those of us earning reasonable amounts in this country, our life expectancy, and then when I have kids, my kids' sort of health and welfare will actually be, no matter how much I've been earning, will not be as good as those in some of the more equal countries. And that's really quite kind of, shocking, or kind of disturbs the equilibrium that we think. Because we think actually, if we just hit away at the bottom, give more resources to those at the bottom, it will be okay. But that's not the case. Yes, you need to put more resources down to those who are most disadvantaged, most marginalised, and have the least. But that's not going to actually improve things. You actually have to, and this is the big policy step, you actually have to give income, improve incomes, or improve the distribution of incomes right the way up the income scale. It's not just the gap between the top and the bottom, it's right the way through. And that message is one that I've been going to Conservative Spring Conference, the Liberal Democrat Spring Conference, I think the Smith Institute last week. It's the one that is actually the key thing in the key new element to the spirit, what the spirit level has been producing. But it's not just Richard who's been saying this, it's not just me going to campaign events and saying this. What we've had in the last couple of months is two weighty tomes. I say weighty in their thickness, but weighty in the credibility and the intellectual work that's gone into them, that have said, actually, income inequality matters, and it's the distribution of income throughout the scale that matters, and not just improving life for those at the bottom. These two reports, John Hill's National Equality Panel report, The Anatomy of Inequality, and Michael Marmot's Health Inequalities report. Very, very established figures in the academic and the policy communities, and both reports actually are quite radical, because they do say it's not, as I say, it's not just the bottom, but they also say, I mean, in Marmot's phrase, what do we need to do? And it's a progressive, find his progressive, proportionate universalism is his policy response, targeting resources at the bottom, but actually that needs to go right the way through, so that income distribution is made more equal. And I say, I've been looking at some of the policy solutions to this, some of the policy ways that we can tackle this, and there's a range. Some of it is on traditional kind of tax and spend, the benefit system, obviously targeting more of the poor, but some of it is actually changing culture as well. And to me that's the really interesting thing. It's not just what government can do, but government can do a lot. It's actually what can be done in public institutions and the private sector as well. Issues like remuneration committees and having employees on remuneration committees, or even other forms of employee democracy, because these are the things that will start getting those people who are very at the top of the income scale, who at the moment are so, I say, way off the stratosphere of, in terms of understanding what's going on elsewhere. It will start to get them realising what ordinary incomes are and how that affects people. Again, another policy solution, one that we're looking at, is the idea of ratios, of actually what is a fair ratio between I say the person at the top, the chief executive, and the lowest paid workers in that organisation. And I say from a conservative point of view, one of the interesting things that's applicable to all parties, but certainly found some kind of note within conservative circles, is looking at the example of the army. Now the army has a pay ratio of 7:1. So the person at the top of the army will only earn 7 times more than a entry-level army recruit, and in fact that goes down to 6:1 ratio when when the army recruit has done their initial basic training and becomes a proper full-time member of the army. Why are they doing that? Why is it 6:1 and not so much greater? Because the army recognises. So I'd like to say that's Richard to tell me an extra point. What have I forgotten? But the army does it because they recognise the value of social cohesion. They recognise the value. They recognise the destruction that income inequality could cause. That seeing the huge disparities and how that might affect morale and how that might affect people's how that might put more stress on people. And I say that's really kind of what I say in the spirit level it comes down to. It's actually what is the personal effect of income inequality? What is it that it's not just why is it that this is something that affects people, and why is it something that affects people whether they're really really poor and have no resources, or whether actually it's people looking at what the Joneses are doing or what other people higher up are doing and trying to keep up with them, and that sense of anxiety, that sense of stress that then causes responses, kind of negative social responses. And I think I'll leave sort of finish up with one point from that Richard likes talking about, and actually when he was on the Today programme with debating with Michael Gove a few weeks ago came up, which was looking at this issue of single parents and sort of welfare issues. And what Richard was saying is actually it's not about whether you have one parent or two, and it's not even about just the level of income per se that you have. it's actually also about, if you're a parent, what kind of society you're preparing your child to grow up in. Are you preparing them to grow up in a dog-eat-dog, very competitive world where you're always looking to try and get one up over someone, or be just in that very stressful, aggressive kind of manner of world, and kind of how you approach things? Or are you actually trying to teach them to be in a world where people are more supportive, it is a more cohesive environment, and that you can, I say, work together, and that really is the key, is it's actually what kind of society do we want? And I would argue we want, for many different reasons, a fairer, more equal society, and the key to that is about reducing income inequality. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. That was extremely well stepped into the breach, almost as if you had arrived with a speaker event. You're wandering around with one. So many questions you can ask about that. I'm going to first go over to Polly for her first reaction, and then we'll open up some questions.
And I'd just like to add a bit more about Richard's work, really. I'm very sorry he's not here. I'm a huge admirer of his. I think that he is coming to be seen as something of a Darwin figure in social research and in what he's discovered. It is a kind of eureka moment, really, because he has put together a whole lot of disparate things, and as Malcolm said, has found this absolutely undeniable correlation, whatever you look at, whether it is crime or murder or social dysfunctions of any kind, levels of depression, sickness, mental sickness, everything, all correlates with this in this extraordinary way with how equal or unequal a country is. And they are across very different types of countries. I mean, Japan is not a society like Sweden, for instance, but it holds good for different sorts of societies. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think it's very, very hard to absorb, and for politicians to absorb what it really means, because the message is very difficult to turn into one that people can understand. One piece of research that he quotes in the book, because you might think, what's the transmission mechanism? Why should it be that very rich people in a country as unequal as ours or America are less happy, less successful, live less long, do less well in lots of respects, than people who have much less money but are rich in more equal countries? What on earth, what's that about? How does this whole mechanism work? And he takes an example. What is the transmission? A lot of people say, well, people very poor in a country, they probably don't know what bankers are getting up to. Why are they in any way affected by that? And the experiment is to take, there was 2 cages, 2 lots of macaque monkeys, which are very hierarchical. We have the sort of silverbacks at the top, who get everything, and the kicked about ones at the bottom who are lowest ranking. Within a very short time of putting monkeys together in the cage, the ones at the bottom start to do very badly and get very high blood pressure. They get actually all the diseases of poverty, they get arteriosclerosis, they get, although they're being fed exactly the same, they get sick, depressed, wretched, miserable, and physically ill, just through the nature of being low status. But when, and the ones at the top do much better. If you then move the monkeys around into other formations in other cages, where the ones at the bottom then climb up the social scale and the ones at the top fall down the social scale according to different sets that they're put into, their position after, I think, about something like 25 months, their physical conditions then also alter. The ones that had been healthiest at the top become sick because pecking orders matter. And when we think about our own society, I think we do deep down know this. We know that it matters. We know from earliest and most unpleasant days, often in school playgrounds, we know who's up, who's down, who's strong, who's weak, matters very much, and that children's happiness at school is very much to do with where they feel they are on the pecking order. We know that kids ascribed no respect, whatever, have to create their own dysfunctional respect system through gang cultures and create their own bizarre and violent forms of gaining respect amongst themselves because they know they have none at all from the society outside. In fact, everything we think about pay structures and why it is these gargantuan sums of money have to be paid to the people at the top is about being top dog. And probably if they were paid in beans, it'd be all right as long as they had more beans than anyone else. And that people at the bottom give up, and you know, they don't take exercise, and they tend to get fat, and they tend to not, you know, then they're told they're not aspirational. I find that infuriating, as if the lack is entirely in their get up and go. We love rags to riches stories, and we like to believe that social mobility exists. It's reaffirming that everything's all right in the world, particularly for those of all of us who are in the top, 10% or so. We are very pleased with the idea that people can move upwards. So rags to riches stories have always been absolutely the most popular, either because you're at the bottom and it could be you, in a sort of reality television show way, or because you're at the top and everything's okay, because if anybody really had to get up and go to the aspiration, they'd be on their way up as well. But the reason, of course, that they're such remarkable stories is because they're so remarkable, because it's so rare. And we find it very hard to believe that very few people make it from the bottom to the top. And when you talk to successful people, they say, but I know lots of people who went to stage schools and they've made it up here with me. And they think entirely anecdotally. They do not think in statistics. And when you say, no, I'm sorry, you just have to look at the statistics. Of course, if you collect together a group of very successful people, they are by definition the few who have made it up there. Even amongst them, when you work out, you know, amongst the judges and the lawyers and the, just about every top occupation, the numbers who've come through from the very bottom are always very few. But it can be misleading, and people want to be misled. And politicians really don't want to think about it. Tony Blair didn't want to think about it. He wanted to think, as David Cameron does and has said specifically, about getting the bottom up nearer the middle. I used in my book about which I went and worked in a number of low-paid jobs called Hard Work, I used the analogy of a camel train crossing the desert. And they're all galloping along or walking along, but at what point can you say that they're no longer in the same caravan when the ones at the top have galloped over far distant sand dunes and are out of sight, and there's a huge gap between them, and the ones at the back are right out of sight at the back? They're no, you know, at that point society has fractured, they're no longer travelling together. And people may not know, and I find it quite difficult to say exactly what is the perfect, you know, is it the army's measure, what is the perfect measure? I don't know. But you know when it's grossly wrong, and you know when the British Social Attitudes, which takes hold every single year, has for years said, you know, 75, 80% of people say that they think society is much too unfair, much too unequal. People do have a strong sense of what's right and what's fair, but it's very hard for politicians to articulate it. I was very encouraged that in his Hugo Young lecture, David Cameron came to The Guardian and gave a really good lecture in not many ways about poverty, in which he mentioned the spiral level, and he thought it was wonderful, and he described some of this research. But then he immediately said, but having said, you know, how fascinating it is that people do less well in unequal societies, he then said, but actually I think the measure used is awfully overly technical, the Gini coefficient, which is the measurement for how equal or unequal a country is according to shares of incomes. I think that's far too mechanical, and really we want to think about, again, about bringing the bottom up to the middle. So sort of taking it in and then just having to put it to one side, as Tony Blair did too, just not able to grasp the fact that it means, yes, shares have to be fairer. The rich have to have less of everything. They have now, you know, the money is being sucked upwards all the time, still, from the bottom to the top, from the middle to the top. Vast amounts of wealth. The wealth there is becoming more solidified than ever before. I mean, one example is that CEOs of top 100 companies 20 years ago earned 15 times their average worker. Within 20 years it had become 75 times. So that's the sort of acceleration that we're seeing. So that even if you thought it was okay now, do you think it okay for it to go on and on getting worse? And is there no ceiling ever to how much worse that gets? Does it not matter at all? And very few people say, it doesn't matter at all. The idea of that trajectory is very alarming, and it does mean less and less for those at the bottom. And you know, I don't think most people want to live in that society. It's not that it's a zero-sum game. You know, the idea of wealth creators, but we can have arguments about who are and aren't the wealth creators amongst the rich, and who are simply the creaming off of wealth from other people's transactions. But all of the evidence is, as Malcolm said, about the gross, you know, the collective unhappiness and depression and sickness of societies that allow themselves to become too unhappy. Now, I think in terms of changing the culture, which you talk about politics, it's very difficult. I think you have to start with people knowing the basic facts. You know, our most recent book, Unjust Rewards, we had a focus group done by Maury, a proper focus group with very top bankers and lawyers in city law firms. And we started off with a questionnaire. They had to fill out, well, what do you think people earn? What do you think is the median? What do you think is the poverty threshold? And they were wildly and madly out of kilter. They put the median income, a couple of years ago, the median income point at which, not the average, the median, the average is pretty meaningless. The median is the point at which half the population earns less and half earns more, was at that point 22,000. They put that as the poverty threshold. And the poverty threshold for a couple was then around 10. So that showed how little they understood. Well, you might say they wouldn't understand about people earning that much less than them. When we asked, you know, what they thought the top 10%, where they thought the top 10% began, their average was something like about 170,000 was where they thought it began. We said no, actually the top tax bracket, 40% tax bracket until next April, is 40,000. 10% of the population earns more than 40,000, and 90% earn less. And most people who are in the above 40,000 bracket simply can't take it in, and within no time at all are going back to another model of society. So until we begin to have this discussion, which I think in the days when trade unions were strong, we used to have much more, because discussions about pay were part of the news, and people also were much more careful within their own companies when there were strong trade unions, because rather like the army, it was just too disruptive to have these outrageous pay differentials if you had a strong trade union. Since then, nobody knows where they stand, and the poor tend to relate themselves as being much nearer the middle. Everybody thinks they're much more ordinary than they are. You know, someone a bit richer, someone a bit poorer, you think I'm middling. So I think the beginning of the political realization about this is to keep getting out the basic facts so that we who are privileged absolutely understand how privileged we are before we even begin to think about what we do about fairer shares. But I'll hand on to Will to talk about politics too.
Thank you, Polly. So we've covered a lot of the arguments here, a lot of the kind of the reasoning. Maybe Will, I don't think we're talking a little bit more about what this means in political and policy terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to say thanks very much, Neil, as well, for inviting me here to speak on this panel. I guess that in a previous era, having three lefties on a panel at Policy Exchange might have been used as evidence to the Charity Commission to show that Policy Exchange was a genuine charity. But no longer. I mean, today, James Dellingpole has described Policy Exchange as lettuce-munching social workers for their policy work on smoking, saying you should use the power of the state to tax smoking and use it to improve health outcomes. So welcome to the left, Neil. And I'm sure after Malcolm's excellent introduction and Polly's interesting remarks as well, that the rest of you have also now converted to the left, those of you who weren't before. So what I'll do is give you a little insight into the challenge we face on the left in pursuing this agenda, why we have this difficulty and what we can do about it. I think the problem, broadly speaking, is that we've ended up in a situation where there's been a missed opportunity over probably 13 years, maybe longer, in terms of this agenda that Malcolm set out so clearly. There is still, as Polly outlined, I'm sure you would all agree with this to some degree, a sense that society is quite unfair, and we're not happy with that. And if you look at the changes that Polly set out in terms of how executive pay is spiraled out of control, how wealth is accumulated by a smaller and smaller group in society, that's something that makes people, I think, regardless of their political persuasion, feel a bit uneasy. But meanwhile, the British Social Attitudes Survey showed that the number of people who are committed to redistribution is declining, and has been declining for a number of years. And at the same time, because of globalisation, which has had its sort of first wave in the end of the 19th century, you could argue, but really through the lowering of communication costs and transport costs has increased rapidly over the last 20 years or so. We've seen really very, very massive increases in inequality across all developed countries and in many developing countries as well. And that means that we're running to stand still. And despite the efforts that the Labour government's made to redistribute money and to lift the poor up over the poverty thresholds through things like tax credits and making work pay and getting more people into the labour market, which I think have been very successful, it's meant that we are now in a situation where the measure that Polly and Malcolm talked about, the Gini coefficient, is higher than it's ever been, and that's very troubling. So why are we in this situation where after 13 years of a Labour government that has done so many things to try and address this, we're in a worse position than we were before? And I think you can actually use the microcosm of the current election campaign to partially explain this. I think the Labour Party is very good at tactics and quite bad at strategy. And I'll explain that. At the moment, as we've all seen, the polls have been narrowing. The Conservative Party, I think, looks like they don't have a clear process from getting to here to election day without more slip-ups and gaps and problems. They haven't spent the time they've been in opposition working out what their policy platform is. They are obsessed by not saying difficult things and pushing things under the carpet, but they keep on popping out the other side. And meanwhile, the Labour Party is a party that quite likes winning elections. It's got quite good at it. It's won 3 elections, we know, but you can argue that it also won the campaigns in 87 and 92 as well, where it increased the number of MPs in both elections by quite a large margin. The Conservative Party have been very good at losing elections. So there's a real fire in the belly, and power is something that people want to hold on to, and also I think in this moment, with the economic crisis, people on the left feel that they can really seize this moment for a more progressive future. So there's a lot about the sort of tactics going on at the moment that show that the Labour Party just has a better sense of it than the Conservative Party. On strategy, however, the right has been much more diligent over an extended period of years to perhaps learn the lessons of what happened in America with the amazing work that happened on the right in the 70s and 80s. In fact, going right back to Barry Goldwater's election defeat in the mid-60s, where academic institutions, think tanks, media outlets, and training schools were put in place to get right-wing ideas into the national consciousness in a very effective way. Some of that also took place over here in the UK. And for a whole host of reasons, the left has never been as coordinated as that. So that's been problematic. And what we see at the moment, I think, is that although the outcome of the election is very much in doubt, and anything could happen, and any outcome, I think, wouldn't be surprising at this stage, there is still a sense in the country that on 3 of the biggest issues we face today, the right have the greater sense of momentum. On the economy, although there's a fierce debate about at what time and with what speed you should bring down the deficit, the conversation is all about cuts rather than about raising taxes or increasing growth, which are 2 very other important aspects of how you bring down the deficit. That's a big problem. Secondly, on climate change, despite what I regard as irrefutable evidence that climate change is man-made, there's an undermining process going on through a large proportion of the media, through the blogosphere, of undermining the science, which is meaning that the public are losing their faith that climate change is man-made. And thirdly, despite the fact that on many social indicators, Britain is becoming a better place, the idea that we live in a broken society is permeated. So there's a problem with strategy here, which I think speaks to why it is that over this period of time, the left hasn't been able to make a greater public case for why you need to redistribute income, why it's so important to deal with income inequality. So what can you do about it? The first thing I'd say is that while David Cameron is absolutely wrong to say that the Gini coefficient doesn't matter, those of us on the left shouldn't get bogged down by it. We have to be able to tell positive stories about what the effect of bringing down income inequality will do. And I think that's why the book that Richard has written and that Malcolm has spoken to is so important, because it talks about this through the stories of ordinary lives, through impact on crime, through the impact on health and well-being, through the impact on many other social factors. And that's the way to make the case for this. Now there is very, very strong evidence that if you bring down income inequality, then you can have better social outcomes, the kind of things that people on right and left are both pushing for. So we have to talk in that language. Secondly, there's a renewed interest in communitarianism, society's back, and I think all political parties recognise that. And there's an interesting debate going on from people on the right like Philip Blond to people on the left like John Cruddas, who share this idea that something's got missing in society about community. And dealing with income inequality and living in a society where there's more social solidarity is something that can be an answer to those interesting questions. So I think we need to appeal to the sense that people have at the moment that there's a lack of community and they want a greater sense of community in order to make the argument for dealing with income inequality. And the third thing, and this is, I mean, just to make it a bit interesting for the audience, I'm going to diverge slightly from Polly, is on aspiration, because I think we do still need to talk about the language of aspiration. To my mind, social mobility is not about everybody at the bottom getting to the top, because if you did that, you'd find you constantly replacing people at the bottom. It's about everybody doing the best for themselves and people having incremental movements up the ladder, people not being stuck earning the same income scale as their parents, people not having the same, not being stimulated by the limited opportunities that their parents had, being able to move on in society. And I think that appeals to something in all of us. And the Chicago School and anyone who studied microeconomics will know very well one absolute truth of that particular dismal science, which is that people are motivated by incentives. The mistake that we've made is to see the only incentive, the only form of utility, to be in cash terms. And there are many, many other ways in which we can get joy and fulfillment in our lives. And so I think we need to be pushing people to do the best for themselves. We need to be pushing people to want to go higher. But we should also be aware that sometimes the rewards don't actually represent the effort. And I'll use two examples here to finish. I think this is where there's a really, really strong agenda for the left as well. I think when the original question was put to Peter Mandelson, who said he didn't care if people got stinking rich, it was in the context of talking about David Beckham. And lots of people say, well, why should we care if David Beckham makes millions and millions of pounds? And you know, he's come from a relatively humble background in Essex. Why shouldn't we care about that? And I think the answer why we care about that is that actually there's been huge changes in the football industry over an extended period of time, with much more money poured into it by the media empires. The difference between the top and the bottom in football has been very dramatic. If you're a lower league club, you don't need to be told that. There's many clubs going into administration. I won't bore people with the sort of intricacies of football, but the point here is an important one, which is that the rewards have been very widely dispersed. And it means that while some at the very top are doing very, very well, there are many, many more people at the bottom who are struggling. And that means ultimately that we won't have as good an England team, we won't have as good competition, we won't have as good players coming through. So that's something to worry about. Take another industry, financial services industry. Adair Turner said last night that this was economically useless activity, a lot of it at the top. What we've seen over an extended period of time is the same thing. More and more awards to the people at the very top. Perhaps some of them have deserved some of it, but all of them certainly haven't. And we need to deal with that so that the rewards are fairly shared. And I think Malcolm has some very interesting ideas. One thing we need to talk about, and it's something which I think appeals to both right and left, or at least it should do, is a more profound competition policy, so that there's genuine competition in industries, and you don't have monopoly rents or at the very top. And I think that's one of the things that's happened, and nobody, whether on left or right, should be interested in seeing that take place. So very briefly then, I think that we have ended up in a situation where there's been a wasted opportunity, and there are reasons for that. And I think there's a lot of rebuilding that the left needs to do to make sure that it's as good a strategy as the right has been over a long period of time. But actually, regardless of what your political persuasion is, we should want this agenda to be seen to fulfillment. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Polly. We have now some time for questions and answers. I'm sure you're bursting to ask things. If it'd be helpful if you just say who you are and where you're from, if we can start. We're doing that. There's a gentleman halfway back, and there's a gentleman at the front.
My name is Peter Saunders. I actually worked with Richard Wilkinson many years ago at Sussex University. It was a different lifetime then. I want to focus specifically on the spirit level before the discussion goes off into more general issues, because I think everybody on the panel has presented to us an idea that the argument is done and dusted, the data is convincing, the theory is conclusive. And I've spent the last couple of weeks actually trying to reconstruct all the data in that book, along with some other data as well, and to extend it over more countries than Richard includes in his analysis. Basically, what you find in a lot of the graphs in that book is that you're picking up a distinction between the Nordic countries and the Anglo countries. And it's a distinction which you can explain historically and culturally, going back for centuries, to do with the value of individualism, which is much stronger in the Anglo countries, to do with being settler countries, the States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and so on. The Nordic countries, on the other hand, being late developers, being strongly homogenous until very recently and being small. And that's why the Nordic countries are more cohesive than the Anglo countries, and it's why the Nordic countries are more egalitarian than the Anglo countries. So what Richard's picking up is he's picking up one aspect of that, which is egalitarianism, putting that as the cause of the other, which is the cohesiveness, where both actually go together. Now, I can show that, and it's unfortunate we've got Hamlet without the print here this evening, because I assumed from the screen that there would have been a load of graphs up there. If you go through that book and look at the graphs and pull out, just put your hand over the Nordic countries on a lot of those graphs, and you find these wonderful sloping lines disappear. All you've got is a random scatter. In particular, if you take out the Nordic countries and the Anglo countries and look at the great cluster in the middle, you've just got a great fuzz of dots. You can't put a straight line through them. Very often, he's breaking all sorts of statistical rules about regression models in those graphs. I'm sorry to bore you, but what we've been given this evening is an empirical justification of egalitarianism. It's got to be answered empirically. He's breaking a lot. There's, for example, some of the graph, if you look at the graph on literacy and maths scores, for example, what you find is if you take out, there's a few countries which are scattering all over the place. If you take them out, you can actually draw the line the other way on the great bulk of the countries. If you look at trust, which is a key variable in that book, take out the Nordic countries, take out the Anglo countries. There's no association. The France, Italy, Spain, all the other countries that are clustered there in the middle, if you try and draw a line through them, they don't have the same level of inequality. They've got different levels of inequality. You can't draw a line through showing the association between inequality and trust. And so it goes on. Now, so there's problems, I think, profound problems with the data and the way the models have been constructed in that book, which we ought to be alerted to. But also, I just think that the theory is unconvincing. The theory is, excuse me, getting excited. The theory is that greater equality reduces psychological stress. That's the essence of it. Japan is cited as a country which is non-hierarchical because it has a compressed income distribution. Japan is one of the most hierarchical countries in the world if you look at status. And actually, what Richard's talked about in that book is really status differentiation. And awareness of where you are in pecking orders is a status consideration. It's not an income consideration. If you had a way of measuring status hierarchies, the importance of status hierarchies in these countries, you'd find that Japan, rather than being one of your best cases for demonstrating your case, is actually one of the worst. Finally, sorry, I'm going on too long, but finally, there's a challenge in the book that says, but you can't find a better explanation, can you? And actually you can. And if you switch for a minute to the American state data, as Malcolm said, you've got 50 American states, and on first reading, it's really impressive that you find the same apparent patterns in the American states as you do in the international data. In the book, Richard Wilkinson himself recognises that you could run ethnic diversity as your variable on the American data, as much as income inequality, and get the same results. In other words, what you're finding, every one of those graphs on the American data, what you're finding is the Deep South, the old Confederate states are clustering at one end of the graph, and New England and all the much more homogeneous white states are clustering at the other end of the graph. Now, what's interesting, if I can just quickly show you this, because this morning, I'm only fiddling around with Excel, because I'm not in the university anymore, I can't get SPSS, but I've been fiddling around on Excel. And I thought, I wonder if the same is true on the international data. And I found an article that measures ethnic fragmentation internationally on 160 different countries. And the measure is, if you took two people at random from a given country, what's the probability that they would be in different ethnic groups? And if you run that ethnic fragmentation against the trust variables, the key variable in that book, what you get is a nice downward sloping line, exactly the same as you get if you run the inequality against trust. That what is going on here is more heterogeneous, diverse countries are less trusting, they're less willing to redistribute income to other people who they feel are less like themselves. The greater the degree of diversity and heterogeneity, the less the degree of social cohesion.
Thank you. It's an extremely well-formed question. Lots to chew on there. Maybe we'll divide up the labour of answering this sort of three critiques there between different members of the panel. Who wants to go first?
Well, I think your last point is interesting because you still don't know about cause and effect. That one of the causes of poverty is often being in an ethnic minority. So it's a bit circular on that one, I'd say. That I think it's probably certainly true that if you've got an oppressed ethnic minority, then you're going to get more inequality. I'm not sure that's less willingness to share. Who knows? But it doesn't seem to me that that's an argument that goes either way. As for the rest, I'm just not in a position to, I'd have to go away and talk to a lot of people and look at the graphs very carefully. But I have to say, an awful lot of academics have been debating and discussing with him for a long time, and I don't think anybody has come up with a review or a peer-reviewed journal that has seriously critiqued it. Maybe you're the person who's going to.
More takers?
Yeah. So I wish I had to hear what I had earlier, kind of thing too. I say one of the benefits that I say is just on the Equality Trust website, equalitytrust.org.uk. Not only are there sections that give most of the graphs that Richard would have given in this presentation, so you can actually, and in fact there is a whole slideshow there, so you can actually kind of go through and see what he would have presented in the graphs. But there's also just added on in the last few days, and I'm guessing that maybe where you had the chance of, okay, is the international data. So the actual data that Richard and Kate used for the books, and I don't think they've yet added on the American data, but certainly all the other international countries, all the other international examples, they've added the data so that you can go on and chew it over to your heart's content, do whatever SPSS and other kind of things, and see. And it's an open kind of thing to everyone. I say my standard, before I go further, I should actually just say, I didn't come here, I didn't enter my job as as the campaign director of One Society as a true believer. I didn't kind of suddenly one day read the book and go, oh my God, suddenly I see the light. Actually, what I did was, firstly, I'm very interested in, I say personally, in kind of social justice fairness issues anyway, so there was from a personal point of view, I wanted to look at these issues. But also, just looking through, reading through the book, it made sense in certain senses. And there were some parts where I actually had kind of, things in society that doesn't fit quite as well as some of the others. I'm not saying that every single, single thing, and that's why Kate and Richard both say in the book, actually, there are some things that fit really, really well. There are some things in one or two of the American states where, partly through cultural differences, the trend line is still good, but it's not quite as strong as in some of the other examples. But if you take everything put together, what you have is graph after graph, data after data, that actually says this is the correlation. And I would say it's not just Richard and Kate who've been doing this. I would say, as I mentioned in my speech, the Marmot report into income inequality, into health inequalities, and the John Hill's report into income inequality, they both looked at a whole series of data themselves. Yes, obviously they read the Spirit 11 and other things that influence diet, but they took a whole series of other things and kept on seeing the same patterns. And for them it was all about actually what is happening between and not just at the top and the bottom. I say, to answer two of your specific questions, one, obviously, I mean, in the American examples, we have New Hampshire as one of the most equal states. Now, or most economically equal states. Now, I don't know whether Will might be able to kind of help me out on this. I think the state's motto, is it something like live free and die, something like that? That's hardly kind of the social, sort of egalitarian Scandinavian model there from New Hampshire. And so I'm getting to the second bit, which is on sort of ethnic segregation. If you were to look at examples, and I say it's in the book and there are other examples as well, you look at areas where one community's come in a very poor area, that community, it's one particular ethnic group, they will move in, it's very poor, there's huge amounts of problems. They move out, you start getting a completely different culture, completely different ethnic group there, and yet they're still facing many of the same problems in society. They're still facing that inequality, and so it isn't just simply kind of one state. It's coming from cultural backgrounds. I'm not going to deny, and as Polly kind of said, there is a link. And it's kind of a very, it's a circular one, almost chicken and egg, between kind of poverty, race, and the entrenched inequalities, particularly in America, about that, and here in terms of class. But I would say that's there. What I would say is on the website, because I don't remember all these things on the website, the Equality Trust website, equalitytrust.org.uk, they actually, Richard and Kate have gone into detail on many of these questions and give much more confident, sort of straightforward rebuttals than I have. So I would say read that, and then if you want to, anyone wants to then come back to the Equality Trust and myself, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, so it'd be good to get other questions in, but just to say thank you to Peter for doing that. And I think this is actually a really brilliant part of what Richard and Kate have done, which is to not only write this book, but to put the data online, allow people to question it. When I read the book, the question that got me was, okay, there's very clearly a correlation here, but what about causality? And I hope that we're at the sort of start of a journey with this, where you will come back with your rebuttal, and Richard will respond, and others may go further into the data. So, I mean, I think this is a sort of great advert for the book and for the work that they've done. The other thing, of course, is that actually many of us on the left were still arguing that we needed to bring down income inequality before the book came out. I don't think just because let's say all the graphs were wrong, I don't think that changes the values-based desire to see a more equal society and to strive for that across a many series of different indicators.
Excellent. I have to now warn you that after those questions, there's going to be a minimum question length. I'm going to demand questions of equivalent length. But so the question is, we might take some in batches, I think. So.
It's Jonathan Hoffman, GLA Economics. I think I have a sort of philosophical problem, and I have also methodological problems. And I'll try not to say the same as the last speaker, although a lot of the problems are the same. I mean, the philosophical problem is, do we really think that in a poor society where everybody is equal, that's better than in a rich society where people are unequal? It sounds common sense, but I mean, that is a basic objection to the book. And coming into some of the methodological arguments, I mean, I'm an economist, and Richard Wilkinson is an epidemiologist, but he's straying into economics territory here very definitely. I don't see a single R squared in this book. Now, R squared is a measure of the goodness of fit of these lines, where how much of the variance of the numbers is actually. I don't see a single R squared. All right, you can go onto the website and calculate them for yourself. But an intellectually respectable book would put in goodness of fit statistics, clearly. I also see charts where different countries are measured on different charts. There's not always the same countries measured on different charts. And immediately you ask yourself, well, is that because some countries don't fit the explanation? I also see these issues about causality. I mean, one example is obesity in Japan. Japan does well on obesity. People are generally not fat in Japan. And I mean, is that because incomes in Japan are equal? Or is it because the Japanese have a different diet? I mean, they eat fish, for heaven's sake. So, you know. But he doesn't even go into those kinds of issues. Clearly, there is a problem of causality. I mean, are poor outcomes the result of inequality, or are they the cause of inequality, or are they associated with some third factor? He simply doesn't go into this. And then, I mean, he has some. Sorry, he has some. I mean, he also goes into wars. I mean, wars increase trust, clearly. I mean, does that mean that, you know, Gordon Brown should invade the Falklands? I mean, maybe he should to win the election. But I mean, you can see where I'm driving. I mean, we don't want to be in times of wars. He compares the treatment of Hurricane Katrina to the treatment of the Chinese authorities, the earthquakes in 2008. He says the Chinese dealt much better with the earthquakes than the US did with Katrina, because China's a more equal country. I mean, for heaven's sake, look at China. This is the country that, you know, closed down people's internets before the Olympics. This is the country that put people in prison before the Olympics. Is that really an argument that you want to take? And I mean, you know, so on and so forth. I think clearly poverty is an issue, and poverty does cause things that one is concerned about, but it's a big step from there to talk about inequality being the cause of all these problems. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to take that one as we're going to hoover up a few more questions because we're slightly running out of time. So if we could go to the gentleman just there, and then there's a cluster of questions over by the fireplace in a moment.
Good evening, everybody. Peter Campbell. Very interesting discussion. Just want to thank everybody for that. I'm also very interested to hear Will Straw deputise the Football League pyramid as a non-league supporter myself. Good to hear that inequality coming to light. I just wanted to know from the panel, what policies would you really want to see enacted to reduce this inequality?
Okay, we're going to hold that, maybe check just a couple more questions from over by the fireplace if we can. If we can get there isn't a mic over there.
Hello. James Stevens, Homeless Federation. I'm conscious I'm actually very erudite people, very clever people, but I just don't really see what the big deal is. The spirit level seems to be the flip side of what David Willis is arguing in his book about the sort of intergenerational sort of inequality. I think there needs to be a lot more attention about what we can do to make society a more productive society instead of squabbling over what is a smaller and diminishing cake, which seems to be what both political parties are all obsessed with at the moment. And then Will, I think it's Will on the far end there, just one corrective. I think we're entirely wide of the mark by the idea on your assessment of environmentalism. My role is to go up and down the country trying to get houses built, and every local authority, whether they're Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, they absolutely love the environment, you know, because that's the way they ensure that nothing ever happens and no houses get built. And it's been the case since the late 1980s. You know, Margaret Thatcher's one who published this Common Inheritance. And the right absolutely love the environment. You know, if that's the way they can stop sort of production taking place in this country and protect their immunity, and all the left-wing institutions, all the left-wing public institutions, which the ministries for protecting middle-class communities, they all love it too. You know, that's the way they can protect their inflated salaries, by doing the bidding of the Tory shires.
Okay, so before we go on to more questions, we've got the central question now, which is what are the standout policies that this kind of thinking implies? I mean, if you think about something like, I don't know, the rise of the meritocracy in the 60s, that was basically the end of grammar schools. What is the standout policy from the spirit level in particular? Maybe we could pick up this point about housing. Housing obviously hugely important in all this. What do we think about all that?
Okay, I'll have a go. I just want to say something from the gentleman in the front here, that this argument is always taken immediately to communism. communism, everybody the same, want to live in China. I mean, I'm sure that he's made references that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but I was rather careful to say, you know, there isn't necessarily a utopian ultimate goal where the Gini coefficient is, you know, produces perfection. What I was saying is, well, let's start from the position, do we want it to get worse than it is now, because it is getting worse, and it's on that sharp trajectory? Would we actually like to pull it back a bit? I mean, we were taught social history was as a sort of onward progress of a fairer society. It happened until about the mid-1970s, when we were more equal than we'd ever been before. And it shot out of control in the 1980s, partly through rapid deindustrialization. We went from 1 in 7 children being poor to 1 in 3 within a very small number of years, like, you know, 3 or 4 years. And at the same time, the Big Bang, the lid came off the top. None of those things were exactly willed or connected, but it's what happened. And it was explosive. It then sort of leveled off pretty much after that, and it's got slightly worse. It leveled off in the 90s, and then it got slightly worse under Labour. I think if people think that it's going to go on that way, and that society really is going to break apart more and more, they do worry about it. And it doesn't mean that we all have to agree about exactly what would the ideal be, because that way lies doing nothing about anything, but just saying, how can we tame this beast that is out of control and isn't really going the direction most people in this country want to go in? And that's the beginning of the conversation. So let's start with, how do we stop it getting worse? And I have a few ideas about that, simple ones. I have a high pay commission that was sort of consultative. It wasn't necessarily fixing solid ceilings to start with, but started by saying, here is our advice to shareholders, a bit like what the API does at the moment. I have a sort of red, amber, green system for remuneration, where you'd say, you know, in this company, if they are really doing what cable and wireless, one particular bad offenders, and they're about to do it again this year, if they are really going to produce a remuneration system that makes no sense whatever in terms of its own industry, let alone everything in general, the shareholders should here be taking action. And if you had a high pay commission, they could be much stronger about saying that, about producing what they thought were reasonable levels for chief executives of local authorities of various different sizes, which also, for particular reasons, has gone out of control in some places because they're determined to only appoint from a very small pool of people who've already been high-paid chief executives for certain local authorities. There are things that can be done with a high pay commission that wouldn't seem to make a lot of sense. I think we should have a living wage without a doubt, and it should be absolutely great. We had a minimum wage, not enough. A living wage ought to be a level at which a family can just about get by on, which in London now would be £7.40 an hour. Boris Johnson signed up to it, Ken Livingstone signed up to it before, that for their own employees and for other people that they give contracts to. It's not unreasonable. Otherwise, we, the taxpayer, are subsidising all those families through tax credits. Why should we be subsidising low-paying employers? I would have a much more progressive tax system. Our system in this country is very unprogressive. When you look at the amount of people actually pay as to what the headline rates are, we're much less progressive than most other countries. Just pick up about David Willett's wonderful book about another way of looking at inequality, dead right about generational inequality, and it's part of the same problem of money getting cemented. He's talking about a certain generation, but they will hand it on to their children in very particular ways. He doesn't really come up with, and as with David Cameron talking about the issue, David Willett's weakest bit is when you get to the end, actually I think it's the weakest bit of this book too, of what the actual recommendations are. There's sort of nothing there, and the natural conclusion of David Willett's books is he's in the wrong party. It's fascinating, and it's got all of the research at work in it, every bit as thorough and detailed as this, and a very well worth reading book. Housing, you're dead right. I'm with Ferdinand Mount on this. He says take planning controls off, let rip. And I more or less would. I mean, I'd leave a certain amount of green belt, but I actually think the housing crisis is so dreadful that you've got to let rip. You know, you can have certain preservation places, but the extent to which local authorities are allowed to prevent house building is part of the problem. And we would need to do everything we possibly can to stop any new housing bubble taking off, which means I'd put capital gains tax on people's homes too, to stop a new housing bubble.
No, that's good. I say, and I'll sort of take on from Polly in a sense where the spirit level quite leaves off, because that wasn't where Richard and Kate wanted to go, was what are the solutions, what are the policies, and really that's what the organisation I work for, Once Society, was set up very much for, was to take forward that and look at some of the issues. But really, I boil it down to firstly two questions. Who's benefited most from the policies of the last 10, 20, 30 years, and who stands to lose the most as we come out of recession into recovery? Who's benefited most? It's a fantastic stat from, Professor Danny Dorling. He's got a book out, I think, in about a month's time, which this will be in, but it's, he says, if you look at life expectancy, those areas which voted most heavily for the Conservatives in 1997 are the ones who've actually had the greatest increases in life expectancy since then. And particularly Kensington and Chelsea, for instance, in that period, life expectancy has increased 1.1 year for every year since 1997. Now, that's obviously not a sustainable rate, because otherwise Kensington and Chelsea residents will be living forever. And I think we all want to agree with that. But in comparison, residents in Glasgow, their life expectancy, yes, it's increased, but it's only increased 1 month per year on average. So that's basically a whole year per year difference. And that's symptomatic of kind of how policies in the last 10, 20, 30 years have affected people. Now going forward, who might, where might the cuts, where might things affect people? And I say, there's a double dip potentially, but not the double dip that the economists like referring to. I refer to it in terms of young people. Now young people have been hit almost the hardest by this recession. And youth unemployment and opportunities for young people are incredibly hard to come by at the moment. But they're also coming of age into a world where social mobility is the worst it's been for a long while. So actually they're being hit by this double whammy, and there's certainly attention on a policy level needs to be focused on that. Otherwise we're going to have a generation of people who are not fulfilling their capabilities and talents. And finally, in terms of kind of the two main policy areas, one, yes, we need to do more for raising up those at the bottom. We need to put more, this is income, but this is also wealth redistribution, looking at wealth as well. I say one policy I quite like the sound of is introducing a life premium for disadvantaged children that will follow them not just through early years, but right the way through their school, their school and sixth form or their college as well, right the way up to age 18, 19. So that actually extra money is going to the services that they're using, the resources that are being done at that point. But also, we can't forget the top, the undeserved, and unearned wealth, and hugely rising at the top, which is a problem. And I would say the two things that I would look at there. One, replace inheritance tax with a gift tax, because many of the most wealthy are able, where their wealth isn't tied up in houses, are able to gift money through to the next generation without any cost whatsoever, no tax going there. Whereas inheritance tax at the moment only captures only about 8% of the wealth, and only and certainly doesn't capture many of the land, the house price rises as well. And I would go back to this issue, I say very much at Polly's heart as well, about transparency in pay, public sector and private sector, whether that's in terms of actually ratios, whether it's just in terms of a transparency so that we all see what people are earning, and we get that first sense of actually those people at the top are so far in the stratosphere, those people down at the bottom, and even not down the bottom, middle, whose wages haven't risen. And I say leave it one statistic, kind of 2008, average earnings, if you look at the statistics, rose, but they only rose because of bankers' bonuses. And we need to actually do more for incomes right the way through society.
I'll be very brief. To our kind of the quick fires.
Yeah, okay, I'll be very brief then. I mean, just to say to Jonathan, as someone trained in economics, we need to be a bit careful about telling other people in other professions that they haven't done great economic analysis, because economists haven't exactly got the themselves in fantastic esteem in recent years. But to answer your question directly, poor society that's equal or rich society that's unequal, well, clearly the rich society that's unequal, but I think the analysis in Wilkinson's book only looked at developed countries. So I don't think it's a question we need to even, I mean, they're all in developed countries, all OECD countries, so I don't think that's something we really need to, I think it's just, excuse the pun, a straw man, so let's leave it there. On Peter's question about practical policies, I agree with many of the things that Polly and Malcolm have talked about. I also signed a petition calling for a high pay commission, although I would have preferred it to be called a fair pay commission because, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think you want to dismiss all high pay. Some of it can be well earned and well deserved. A couple of other things there which I think are important. Competition policy I'll go back to is really critical here because if we have proper competitive sectors, then we will avoid some of these monopoly rates which are manifesting themselves in terms of pay at the top. So that's really critical. Part of that actually is about tax avoidance, which is one of the things that the people behind the High Pay Commission are calling for. And we need to deal with that. It was that old socialist Nigel Lawson who equalised capital gains and income tax in the 1980s. I think it was a mistake of the government to create initially a lower rate of capital gains of 10%. And I think we should go back to Red Nige and his policies. James, I didn't quite understand your critique. Perhaps we'll have a chat afterwards. But I don't think it's inconsistent to be worried about climate change and its impact, which is what I was talking about, while at the same time believing, as Polly does, that actually we need to do more house building and we need to work out where the incentives lie at a local level. What I would urge you to do is read Left Foot Forward on Saturday, where John Crillis is writing an article for us on housing policy, and we'll set out a whole series of interesting ideas.
Very good. I was going to suggest, we are very much right to the end. I was going to say some very, very, very brief questions in our last round. I can see there's so many, we're just not going to get through them all. Let's pick off maybe one or two, if we have a gentleman there. Just there. Yeah. Two of you.
Yeah, just make a quick point on the methodology. I basically agree with these two gentlemen. Obviously been doing some kind of work to myself, having a look at this book. But there's one very simple point with it, I think, which is, I think Portugal holds the key, because Portugal is actually a very poor country compared to America or Norway, and yet the idea of the spirit level is that beyond a certain level of wealth, you don't need to worry about gaining any more wealth. Well, Portugal consistently performs very badly in these graphs, but the reason for that, quite plausibly, must be that it is so much poorer than the other countries. And yet, while Portugal is included, you've got richer countries like South Korea, like Hong Kong, like Czech Republic, Slovenia, are all excluded from the analysis. And I'd like to ask Professor Wilkinson, who was here, why that was.
We'll take it as a point then, I think, because it's rather than a question. So there was a gentleman there.
Married Conti, environmental economist. Just like to make a point with respect to the first speaker. If what you were saying is that it's trust what determines the quality of life and happiness and well-being, then the key question will be to what extent increasing or reducing inequality impacts on trust within a society. A question for the panel is to assess whether reducing inequality is a good thing or a bad thing. We need to look at what the costs and benefits are. Clearly you've set out what the benefits are, but have you considered what the costs are associated with increasing or reducing inequality?
Good. We might, I'm afraid, have to take that as the last question. So if I can...
We'll take that last one.
There's one here that probably I think is keen to say, but there's a lady here.
Thank you, Polly. Lizzie, I'm from Citizens Advice, but I actually want to draw attention to the army model. I've lived in army communities for 25 years, and I don't think it's just about the range of salaries. I think it's about common values, common purpose, and a whole bunch of other things. There's an awful lot of criticism that can be levelled at military communities, but they have something that a lot of the rest of our society is losing, and I think actually it would be very useful to have another look at the army model and look at what else it can offer. Thank you.
Just a nice observation. So, just to sharpen that, one of the questions there, you all might agree that you want to try and reduce inequality, and you have various ideas. to try and get there, but are there some costs you're not even recognising? If we spend more, for example, benefits, are we going to reduce work incentives? If we try and have a more progressive tax system, will we lose all the high earners? Do we take these things seriously, or do we think that they are overdone?
Well, work incentives are always a problem, but there are always quite a lot of people who are quite happy. Well, it's complicated, but I think I'd say the worst problem with this is that you lose elections. If you're not very careful.
The Marmot Review said simply, the cost to not doing anything about health inequalities is far greater than the costs of any actions. They knew that if they proposed really expensive policies that in this climate that would get shouted down. But what they said is actually just that if we're thinking as an economy and as businesses of raising the retirement age up to something like 68, at the moment 2/3 of people are economically disabled by the time of 68, or economically disadvantaged by the time of 68, in terms of their productivity for doing work is significantly harmed to the extent that they would not be able to work at the age of 68, was what he found. So what I would say is actually we need to look at different things, there are different ways, and just simply I agree in terms of the army example. I say we look at income, and what I'm obviously trying to promote is the idea of greater income equality, not total equality, but greater. But it's what it then brings to the rest of society, and vice versa is actually what I want, because it's not. I don't want just a more equal world in terms of income. Actually, that more cohesive community that you're talking about is very attractive as well.
Just to answer the first gentleman's question, I hope I get this right, but my understanding of Richard and Kate's work was that it included OECD countries. I don't think some of those countries you mentioned are in the OECD, which is, I think, the simple reason why they weren't included. And in regard to Portugal, I don't want to live in Portugal, although I quite like going there on holiday. But what I want is the best for Britain, and I'm very compelled by this evidence which suggests that one of the ways in which you can create a society which is more inclusive, has better outcomes on health and crime and a whole lot of other areas, is to, you shake your head, but I don't think at the moment either of us...
There's nothing in the book says that that's crime. Homicide says excuse homicide, it didn't say anything about crime.
I'm sorry, I thought homicide was a crime. Let's have the discussion afterwards so that people can go home. But my sense is that this speaks to a set of values that people on the left have. There's a lot of evidence here that we need to learn a bit more about. There's some very compelling things in this book and in the other studies that Malcolm's talked about. It's about wanting the best for your country, and I think that there's a number of compelling reasons why we want to see a more equal society, and to look at some of the trends that have taken place over a long period of time. To answer Larry's question very briefly, I used to work in that building across the way for 4 years, and we did cost benefit analysis on every policy. I'd say that actually the costs are a lot clearer than the benefits, because you can measure the tax income you bring in, what you spend it on, all that kind of stuff. Actually, the benefits is where I think we need to put the academic professions into looking at and think about actually how do we measure what the impact of these policies would be as opposed to the counterfactual. So I'll just reframe that. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we've had some brilliant contributions from the floor this evening, very interesting questions. I thought we might end with a very quick vote. Who in the audience do we think, this is a very unscientific one, who in the audience thinks reducing inequality is the main answer to our problems? Who thinks that's the main thing we need to do?
Even by a bit, never mind how much.
There's quite a lot of equalitarians here. There's quite a lot of who disagrees? Who thinks that there's always elsewhere?
The economists.
The economists. It's like, this is like the old joke about economists. A priest, a missionary, and an economist go on the golf course. They're held up by some people who are blind. They're playing very slowly, and they complain about this, and they find out that these guys are blind. They say, "I feel." The priest says, "I feel terrible." I say, "I'm complaining about these guys being so slow," and it turns out they're blind. And the missionary says, "It's awful. I feel terrible." And the economist says, "Why can't we get the blind people to play at night?" Brilliant contributions to the floor, brilliant contributions from our panel, in particular our last our last minute panelists, will start the evening by welcoming me to the left. Given that we've lavished praise this evening on the Army, given that we've all agreed that we should build far more houses, I think I should welcome all of you to Policy Exchange instead. Thank you all the panelists, particularly Michael, and thank you all for coming.